Hello and welcome. I am Ann Peters from the Pulitzer Center, and we'll get started here in a few minutes with today's conversation on African migration, statelessness, and belonging with journalists Ty McCormick and Hassan Ghedi Santur. As we wait for more of our audience to join us, please let us know in the chat where you're listening in from. And for those of you who have not joined us before, we wanted to let you know that the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization with the mission to elevate public engagement with underreported issues. While we're based in Washington, D.C., our staff and our work are global. We support more than 170 reporting projects each year in collaboration with news outlets around the world, bringing together this work by themes on our website, not only on migration, but also racial justice, public health, the environment, and more. We don't stop with the reporting. Our education programming spans elementary schools to graduate degree programs and outreach to the broader public. We create opportunities for communities to come together around topics throughout the year, as well as during our annual conferences. Just last week, we held this year's conference, Environment Redefined. It was our first virtual annual conference and a truly global gathering with audience registrations from 90 countries. All of those conference sessions are on our website via our webinars on demand section in case you missed any of them. And now a few logistics before we move on. We'll start the conversation with our guests and then have time for questions from the audience. You'll see a Q&A icon on your screen. Please begin adding any questions you have throughout the conversation. And then we'll have time to answer, hopefully, as many as we can. There is also a chat icon on your screen. Please use that for any specific technology issues you might have, but please note that all attendees are muted. But if you can't hear us, let us know. We want to let you know that we're also recording this session to post online for others who could not join us today. And one final logistic note, please remember to stay online once the session ends to participate in a brief survey. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Ty McCormick is a senior editor at Foreign Affairs and a former international correspondent who has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Newsweek, and National Geographic. From 2015 to 2018, Ty was based in Nairobi, Kenya, as Africa editor of Foreign Policy, where he led a team of writers that won a Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award for a Pulitzer-supported series on African migration. Beyond the Sand and Sea, published in March of this year, is his first book. Hassan Ghedi Santur is a journalist, editor, and novelist. His journalism work has appeared in the New York Times, The Walrus, Yahoo News, and CBC Radio, among others. He's the author of the novels Something Remains and The Youth of God, and the nonfiction book Maps of Exile. The Youth of God was a finalist for the Pias Adesanya Memorial Award for Excellence in African Writing, 2019, and nominated for Canada Reads, 2020. He is currently working on his third novel, Imagined Lives. And now I'd like to hand the microphone off to Hassan.
Great. Thank you so much, Anne, for the kind introductions, and also my special thanks to the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, not just for hosting this conversation today, but also for supporting independent journalism for nearly 20 years now and allowing journalists like me and Ty through your generous support and the privilege to travel and report on stories that we care about. So yes, my special thanks to the center. And now Ty McCormick, I want to turn to you. I am thrilled to bits that you're doing this with me. I have known you for many years now and have always been a huge fan of your work as a journalist, and I have respected the depth and the intelligence of your work, but above all, the humanity of your work. And now you've managed to sort of put all that, those skills and talents together to produce this beautiful book that I'm such an admirer of. So I have so many questions I want to talk to you about, that I want to ask you, and things I want to talk to you about. But before we do that, let's start with a little reading from you to give people a bit of a taste of the book.
Thanks, Hassan, for that really generous introduction. I want to echo the words of thanks that you said to the Pulitzer Center, it's not an exaggeration to say that the Pulitzer Center really launched my career as a foreign correspondent with a grant that allowed me to report on the aftermath of the Egyptian Revolution in 2011, and then subsequently another grant in South Sudan. And then most recently supporting a really ambitious reporting project for Foreign Policy magazine, where I used to be the Africa editor, looking at African migration to Europe and the ways in which European policies were being set up to essentially to thwart that migration. So all of that has been, a tremendous privilege to get to do, supported with the Pulitzer Center. And so I wanted to thank you for the really important work that you do. Hassan, it is such a privilege to get to be here with you today. We met, I think, in Mogadishu in 2015, which feels like a long time ago. I immediately went out and ordered Hassan's tremendous debut novel, Something Remains, and have followed his writing and his reporting since then. His most recent novel, The Youth of God, which I have here, is just a beautiful meditation on themes of alienation and identity and belonging in the Somali diaspora in the United States and in Canada, I should say, not in the United States. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful book. And I couldn't recommend it highly enough. I will read briefly from the introduction of my book now, which takes place here in New York, where I join you from today. As he stood in line for immigration at John F. Kennedy International Airport, Asad Hussein tried to recall the final stanza of a poem by William Ernest Henley. In front of him, over the heads of a dozen disheveled travelers, stood a row of glass cubicles marking the border of the United States. Unremarkable as it must have seemed to the other travelers that day, the sterile, fluorescent-lit gateway to America felt surreal to him. Years before, in a desert refugee camp in East Africa, he had scrawled the poem on a slab of sheet metal he used to keep the sand from blowing into his tent. Henley's words had famously sustained Nelson Mandela during his long imprisonment on Robben Island, and Asad had sought in them a similar source of inspiration. He had hoped they would strengthen his resolve to one day reach the United States. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. How many times had he read those lines, growing up a citizen of nowhere in the world's largest refugee camp? A sea of sand and thorn scrub and makeshift tarpaulin dwellings in the dry badlands of northeast Kenya, the camp had been home to more than 500,000 people at one point, a city the size of Kansas City or Atlanta, except without electricity or running water. There were no paved roads, no two-story buildings, no permanent structures of any kind. Most of the refugees had fled the war in neighboring Somalia, but a growing number, like Asad, had been born in the camp and never seen their home country. Members of this new generation had spent their entire lives in limbo, everything from the food rations that kept them alive to the arcane resettlement process that offered the only hope of a better future, hinged on the whimsy of distant powers. In Dadaab refugee camp, no one is master of his fate. Yet somehow, after 22 years of waiting, Asad had made it here. In his back pocket was a UN-issued travel document that contained a student visa. Tucked inside the document's light blue jacket was a form stating the impossible. He had been admitted to Princeton University and awarded a scholarship worth $70,000 a year. It was more than his entire family, probably his entire block in Dadaab, had ever seen in their lives, and so improbable that he hadn't allowed himself to fully process what it meant. He didn't dare. Too many times he'd been on the cusp of breaking free from Dadaab, only to have it re-ensnare him at the last moment. There was the promise from the UN Refugee Agency of resettlement in the United States that had gone unfulfilled for 13 years. The prestigious Canadian scholarship he had devoted his entire childhood to winning, only to fall short of the grade, and the desperate attempt to smuggle himself out of the camp that had ended with him behind bars. Then came an executive order from President Donald Trump that shook Dadaab like an exploding mortar shell. Just days before his parents were scheduled for an interview at the US Embassy in the Kenyan capital of Nairobi, the final step in the arduous vetting process for green cards, the United States suspended all refugee admissions and banned travelers from 7 Muslim-majority countries, including Somalia. Now, as the customs line inched forward, he felt sure someone would snatch this opportunity from him as well. The Trump travel ban wasn't supposed to apply to him since he had been born in Kenya and granted a student visa, but he knew the agents at the border had the final say on who entered the United States, and there were plenty of reasons they might turn away a 22-year-old ethnic Somali man. Already, a mysterious American official had intercepted him on his layover in the Frankfurt airport. She had peppered him with questions, some of them surprisingly blunt. Have you ever been a member of an extremist organization? Do you know anyone who's been a member of an extremist organization? With each shuffle forward, Assad's anxiety grew. By the time he reached the front of the line and a young Latino agent with a crew cut beckoned with a pair of raised fingers, he could feel himself freezing up, the hint of a childhood stammer creeping back into his voice. Just answer the questions the way you practiced, he told himself. Look the agent in the eye, smile. The first few questions were pro forma. What did he plan to study? Was this his first time to the United States? The agent swiveled in his chair to face his computer screen. His sullen expression gave no hint as to what he was reading, but as the minutes dragged on, Assad was gradually overcome with a feeling of dread. Then, without warning, a light above him began to blink red. Would you come this way, please? The agent said, stepping out from behind his desk and gesturing to a dimly lit hallway at the end of a row of cubicles. We would just like to ask you a few more questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ty, for that really arresting opening scene from your book. It sort of simultaneously gives you a little bit of backstory, but also sets this narrative, this sort of epic narrative that you do so beautifully. And the line that really jumped at me when I read that, when I heard you reading, is "I am the master of my fate," and that's the idea of fate and how much control we have over our lives is something that I really want to explore with you later, and what happens to people when that agency is taken away from them. So I will ask you about that later. But first, first of all, I have so many questions. I don't even know where to start. But I suppose a good place to start is how did Assad Hussein, this remarkable young man that you chronicle, whose story you chronicle in the book, come into your life to begin with?
Unfortunately, we have Donald Trump to thank for that. It was the Trump travel ban in January of 2017 that brought him into my life. At the time, I was the Africa editor at Foreign Policy magazine, and it was a story that we urgently needed to cover. And a few months before that, I had come across an article in the New York Times Magazine by a young man who had grown up in the camp. And it was this beautifully written short article about his sister's return to the camp after something like 13 years. And I filed away the name at the time, and I never in a million years did I think that the author was still stranded in the camp. I thought for sure he'd been one of the lucky few to get out to win a scholarship. There's a scholarship that's very common, not very common, but it's won by sort of the top handful of students in the camp every year. They go to Canada. It's arguably one of the most generous scholarships in the world. You can sponsor your whole family to go with you. In any case, I assumed based on the quality of the writing and the venue that the writer had been one of the lucky few to win this scholarship. So I reached out to him after the ban came down and I said, would you be interested in tracking down families that were directly affected, that had been expecting to be resettled imminently and now were stranded as a result of the ban? And he wrote back and said, that's the story of my family. We've been waiting for 13 years. And my parents were on the cusp of getting their green cards, and now the door has been shut in our face one more time. He said something to the effect of, the world seems to be working against us. And so I asked him if he would write the story of his own family's experience, and he wrote a really beautiful, gutting story for Foreign Policy about that 13-year window, from when he was born in the camp to when they were promised resettlement in 2004 to the endless obstacles that just kept seeming to keep them stranded in the camp. And after that was when we sort of started meeting in person, and I got to learn more about his story over time, and the book project was eventually born.
Mm-hmm. And at what point in your getting to know him did the idea occur to you, or that the realization that his story is unlike anything? I've certainly never heard of a story like that, and I'm sure, I'm assuming it's probably the same for you as well. At one point in that journey, did you think this would actually make for a great book?
So it's interesting. This was an idea that I had sort of rattling around in my head long before I met Assad.
Okay.
I had become interested in, ever since my first trip to Dadaab in 2016, I believe. I went to cover an unrelated news story, also for foreign policy, a story sadly that keeps recurring, the story of the Kenyan government threatening to close Dadaab down and expel its hundreds of thousands of residents and send them back to Somalia. That happened in 2016, as it has happened again this year, and I went to cover it. And I was so struck by the permanence of this supposedly temporary city. I describe it in the book as a permanent temporary city, that I started to want to write about this experience of prolonged, kind of what I call permanent exile. There was a statistic that I stumbled upon that just blew me away, which is that what the UN calls a protracted refugee crisis, a crisis that's lasted for 6 years or longer and doesn't have an immediate prospect of being resolved. The average length of one of those in the mid-90s was something like 8 years, and today it's 26 years. So essentially what has happened is that many of these refugee crises have been frozen in time. Camps like Dadaab, like Kakuma on the other side of Kenya, have become permanent fixtures of Kenya, even though Kenya, of course, for a long time, Dadaab did not appear on maps, official maps of Kenya. It still is not treated as a city. Its residents are not allowed to work. They're not allowed to leave the camp. There's a certain level of delusion that is at play here with these camps. And so that sort of background idea was an idea for a book on permanent displacement and permanent exile, in search of characters. And so I must have known pretty early on when I met Assad that I knew that I was taken with him as a person, because the first time I met him, I went home and I wrote up 6 pages of notes after that very first meeting. I can't recall having taken such detailed notes about any other meeting that I've had. I often journal for the purposes of keeping a record of things, but this is an unusually detailed one, and I was able to draw on it for the book that I ended up writing. I don't think that I knew I was going to write a book about him, nor had we discussed any such possibility, but just hearing about his journey and the ways in which he had overcome these tremendous obstacles just to see the outside world. I think it's important to note at that point, we didn't know he was going to go to Princeton. We didn't know how this story was going to end. He was in many ways kind of at the end of the road at the point that I met him. He had failed to win this Canadian scholarship. He had failed to win another kind of secondary scholarship that a lot of refugees strive for, called the DAFI, a German scholarship that allows you to study in Kenya, but of course then does not allow you to transfer your status to legally work in Kenya. So it's kind of sort of something to do for 4 years, but it's not actually a route to any kind of permanence or career. In any case, he had fallen short on both of those counts. His parents, of course, were now stranded in Nairobi because of the Trump travel ban. So there was really no indication that he was going to make this really improbable leap into a place like Princeton at that time. But just the story of his intellectual inquiry and the sort of self-directed study that he did, he sort of designed a great books education for himself in the camp. He seemed just kind of propelled by this boundless curiosity. In fact, even in our first conversation, and I recall this in the book too, he just kept asking me questions over and over and over again. And it seemed like he was kind of mining me for information about the outside world that he still had not seen. He'd still not been outside of Kenya at that point, and he had never been to his parents' home country of Somalia, where I had done some reporting before that. And so he wanted to hear about my experiences there. So certainly it was his boundless curiosity that drew me to him. It was the incredible length of his family's odyssey that made it, these two things kind of fit together. And this idea that was in search of characters and his story then became kind of a natural fit and allowed the book project, I think, to make sense.
No, absolutely. And since we're going to be mentioning the word Dadaab a lot, and for a lot of people who might be tuning in who do not know what Dadaab is or what it looks like, can you just give us a brief sort of visual sense of what this place is and where it's located, just sort of the basic information about this place?
Dadaab is a fascinating, complex, infuriating, in some ways, really devastating relic of the Somali Civil War. It was set up in 1991 or early 1992, and as a place of temporary refuge. And it is still with us today as a second or third generation of refugees grows up under the same conditions. It's a tough place to describe to people who haven't been there. In the book, I compare it to the fictional town of Macondo from 100 Years of Solitude, which Garcia Marquez famously describes as cut off from civilization by measureless swamps and forbidding mountain ranges. And of course, there are very few outside visitors to Macondo. There are just these traveling gypsies that come from time to time to sell their wares. Dadaab is also cut off from civilization, not by mountains or swamps, but by this semi-desert that extends over much of the northeast part of Kenya, and also by kind of an invisible web of restrictions and barriers that are designed to keep people from leaving and to keep them in a kind of permanent limbo. There are also, of course, very few outside travelers to Dadaab. The traveling gypsies that make their way there are mainly foreign aid workers and journalists like myself. And when you come to Dadaab, you come by air almost certainly. There are road links, but they're not terribly secure, and it would take you a couple of days coming from Nairobi to get there. So you take a UN flight, and when you're flying along, it's really something to behold, because you are really looking at kind of a vast nothingness underneath you for probably an hour outside of the flight from Nairobi. It's just kind of shrubs, semi-desert, sand, not a sign of humanity in any direction that you can tell. And then you cross this kind of invisible line, and row after row after row of tiny dwellings just unfurl to the horizon. And you land on what is, I think, the only paved strip of asphalt, probably for 100 kilometers in any direction. And you can see these dwellings up close, and you can see what they're made from. They're made from thorn scrub, from scraps of plastic, some leftover tarps issued by the UN. Some of the refugees have made bricks out of the earth. Maybe there's a slab of sheet metal like Assad had on his home. And you realize that these homes have looked this way for 30 years, for 3 generations of people that are growing up and living in this permanent temporary place.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And I remember actually in 2012, I think, I came to Kenya I was at the time with CBC Radio, and I was making a radio documentary about the Somali Civil War, a documentary called Things We Lost in the War. And I wanted to actually go to Dadaab and interview some of the people who lost, so much in the war. And it took me like a month of every day calling UNHCR and whoever else was responsible for me being allowed to go in there. And I bring that up just to give an idea of how controlled that space is. That you and I just couldn't walk there and talk to people.
Yeah, one of the themes of the book is really these separate universes and worlds and the kind of hard edges around them. And I think that Dadaab is a world unto itself, and that is largely a product of the policies that have been put in place to keep people stranded there.
Absolutely. And after a month, I gave up and went back to Canada because I was like, I can't wait anymore.
You never got there after all
that?
I
never got to see it, unfortunately. Yeah. But you paint such a vivid picture of Dadaab and the sort of the poverty and the deprivation and the countless indignities experienced by the residents of that place. But for me personally, what hit me really the most was the absolute sense of powerlessness that the residents live with on a daily basis. And every part of their lives are sort of circumscribed by either the Kenyan government or the NGOs that are there to help them, or sometimes even sort of seemingly random policies that are pronounced in faraway capitals like the Muslim ban, which has stranded thousands of people who were in the process of being relocated. So there is really, I find that really so hard to understand what it feels like to be that powerless over your own fate. And I was wondering if you could just sort of touch on that, because to me, that is a form of trauma, not to to experience that extended sort of state of limbo and powerlessness for so many years, for so many decades. So if you could just sort of describe what that does to a person, that powerlessness.
Agony. Agony is the word that Assad uses over and over again throughout the book. And frankly, is a word that I've heard other refugees describe the feeling as. I think it is an excruciating experience to be wholly dependent on a bureaucracy that seems indifferent to your suffering, whether that is the humanitarian apparatus that is there to essentially to keep you alive. I say alive, but prevented from living in the book. Or that is the resettlement apparatus that is kind of the only hope of a better future. But that, of course, is also run in a deeply impersonal, deeply humiliating way that leaves people waiting and waiting and waiting. There's a kind of tragic minor character in the book who is Assad's older brother, Ibrahim, who has very sadly kind of fallen into an addiction of a leaf that is commonly chewed there called Mira, and has sort of given up on, certainly given up on coming to the United States, and is sort of less interested, I think, in being, in taking part in anything that involves hope of any kind for the future. And I spoke to him for the book, and the thing that he told me really broke him was having to wait on this bulletin board that UNHCR sets up outside of its headquarters in Dadaab that gives you an update on your family's resettlement case. When you're in the resettlement pipeline, it's not like somebody comes to your tent or your home and says, you know, your number is up, we'd like you to report at, you know, on Tuesday at 6:30. None of it's online, none of it's digitized. There's a bulletin board with a printout, and you go day after day, week after week, month and year after year, and in their case, decade after decade. And it was his job to check this bulletin board every day. And I think the dread of going there and knowing there would be no news in the end was what drove him kind of to hit the limit of what he could take. And so that, I think, is at the core of the refugee experience because of the way it's been set up. I think it's important to say this is not because these people are desperate or dependent. It's because of the policy choices that we have made as the international community to leave these people at the mercy of the aid agencies, to forbid them from having any agency over their lives. They're not allowed to work. They're not allowed to travel. They're not allowed to own property. They're not allowed to do virtually any of the things that people in Western societies and in the rest of Kenya, frankly, take for granted. They are not allowed to do.
Absolutely. And it's not just addiction that some people fall into, and depression and all sorts of other mental health issues, but also there have been few cases of suicides. And you do talk about, I think his name is Muhammad, a young man who takes his own life out of just sheer hopelessness, I suppose.
Yeah, there's a young man that makes a short appearance in the book who the parallels to Assad they're uncanny. He is very driven, academically minded young man who grows up like so many others, dreaming of coming to America. He's waited for many years in the resettlement pipeline. The Trump travel ban, you know, forecloses that avenue, as many people I spoke to in 2019 in the camp said, you know, resettlement is finished, it's over. And so I think he took that message to heart, and he initially channeled his energy into the only other real escape valve from the camp, which is this Canadian scholarship I mentioned before, that so many refugee students spend their childhoods striving for. Assad did, his best friend Becker did, so did this young man who his friends called him Gaddafi because he had been their elected student leader in school long enough to be, in their view, a Middle Eastern despot. And so he was, by all accounts, extremely well-loved young man, very bright, had done very well in the early years in school. His academic performance, I think, suffered a little bit in the later years, and he fell short of this only other way out of the camp, which is this Canadian scholarship. And as a result of being unable to see any other way out, he ended up taking his own life. And it wasn't an isolated incident, I should say. There have been a number of suicides that I'm aware of, more of them actually in Kakuma refugee camp on the other side of Kenya, which is predominantly home to South Sudanese refugees. But there was a spate of, I think more than a half a dozen suicides within a very short period after the Trump travel ban came down. So many that aid workers began confiscating potentially deadly objects from the refugee community because they were so unnerved by what had happened.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that your book does so beautifully, is that it gives you a real sense of what it feels like emotionally and psychologically to be, and I'm going to borrow a phrase by Salman Rushdie, one of the international bastards of the world. And, this is not, we're not talking about small numbers here. According to the UNHCR, there are now 79.5 million displaced people around the world. And that's just a number I can't even fathom. But I suppose my question is, what do those of us who are lucky enough to have a country to call home, and with all the privileges that comes with, owe to the Assads of the world? I mean, what can we do as individuals? Because to me personally, when I watch the news, it just seems so hopelessly overwhelming to consider the fates of nearly 80 million stateless people in the world.
That's the danger, is that people get overwhelmed and they throw their hands up and say, there's nothing we can do. I actually don't believe that. I think that it's actually a solvable problem. The problem is political will. It's not ability to solve this. The number that you reference, almost 80 million, that's displaced people, including internally displaced people. Many of those people would prefer to return home to their home countries, or they are in their home countries by definition as being IDPs, but they would like to return home rather than going to a third country. So really we're talking about 24, 25 million registered refugees who are in the system that nominally makes them eligible for resettlement. Right now, the resettlement system is just woefully inadequate to the task. It resettles less than 1% of those 25 million people every year. It's about 35 or 36 designated resettlement countries around the world that take people through that system. The US, of course, used to be the world leader in refugee resettlement. I think a lot of people are surprised, given the United States' very checkered history in this department. We, of course, turned away Jewish refugees in the 1930s. We, were not at our best during the Vietnam War, turning away many of those who supported the American war effort there. We, of course, are dragging our feet on issuing visas to Afghans and Iraqis that supported the American wars there. So much to improve on in that department. But since 1980, the US has resettled 3 out of 4 refugees that have been resettled anywhere in the world. It's about 3 million out of 4 million in total. So in any given year prior to the Trump presidency, the US was resettling more people than Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, and the rest of these countries added together. The first order of business needs to be, for the United States anyway, for those Americans listening into this call, needs to be restoring the refugee resettlement system to something, at least to the level that it was before the Trump administration. The Biden administration, of course, promised that it was going to do this, and not only was it going to restore it, but it was going to expand refugee resettlement to a cap of 125,000 per year, which it would be more than it ever was during the Obama years. It's, of course, still a drop in the bucket in terms of the need. But I do think that there is scope for rallying more countries to join that group of countries that are resettling people. And then, of course, scaling it up. The US, could resume its position as a leader, lean on its allies to do the same. This gets me in a lot of trouble when I say it, but I believe that China should be part of this discussion. People who work in refugee resettlement get really uneasy when you say that. They're, of course, don't have a good record when it comes to human rights. They are treating their Uyghur minority horribly. And so people say, well, how could you even talk about China as part of the refugee resettlement system? The fact of the matter is that they don't participate at all, and they don't even have a definition of asylum in their legal system, despite being soon to be the largest economy in the world, the largest country in the world, and a country that has leadership ambitions on the world stage. I think there is scope for engaging them in this in a productive way. I think it bears noting that there are natural migration routes between Africa and China already right now. There are parts of China where there are large African populations that have come of their own accord for reasons of economic migration. I think if that's possible, then it would be possible to have some level of resettlement through the UN system. Maybe it needs to be sensitive to more factors than it would be for the rest of the countries. Maybe you're not sending people from predominantly Muslim countries, but I do think that there needs to be a discussion about China pulling some of its weight. I think the United States needs to continue to be the world leader on this. It bears a lot of responsibility for having displaced a lot of these people in the first place. And so I think you can pat America on the back for being, the world leader in refugee resettlement, but then you also have to ask, well, why are so many people displaced in the first place? And the Iraq War and the Afghan War have created millions and millions of refugees. And so I think it's only right that the United States continues to be a leader here in refugee resettlement.
Not to mention, I think you can make the argument that Somalia has been in the state that it has been in for decades now, partly because of some really terrible policies post 9/11, such as the US support for the invasion of Ethiopia into Somalia, which has exacerbated what was already a really horrible situation. So it's not just for, in Iraq and Afghanistan, but I do want to touch on the idea of I think a lot of people know that refugees are actually really great for the country, the host countries, the countries that they eventually make home. I am, somebody who, my family was a refugee. We did end up making Canada our home. And I am now like to consider myself as a great ambassador for all things that is good and great about Canada. And so aside from the hard kind of economic factors and reasons that we know now, which makes refugees good for the host countries, there's also the soft diplomacy of actually having millions of good ambassadors around the world for those countries. So it seems like politically, it seems like such a sort of no-brainer, but there is some kind of an impediment that I don't really understand. And maybe you can sort of help me understand why it's still so hard for politicians to get this simple fact.
I couldn't agree more with you that it is arguably the most powerful soft power tool that the United States has at its disposal. You visit places like Dadaab prior to the Trump travel ban, and people have an extraordinarily high opinion of the United States. I often say they have a higher opinion of the US before they get here than they do once they've been resettled. But I think it's not just that it's a land of opportunity, that it's a place where you're going to get to start over and begin anew. I think it is because of the perceived generosity of the country, and also because of this idea of self-improvement that I think is so integral to the American identity. Of course, America falls short of this every day, but I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that more than many other countries, in its DNA is this idea of recognizing its shortcomings, of addressing them, and putting a better foot forward the next day. And when that better foot forward is a refugee who has come to the country and become an American and then can be a spokesperson for that country, I think the power of that example is extraordinary. And you look at someone like Ilhan Omar and the message that she's able to send by virtue of her experience is a profoundly moving and powerful message to countries around the world. And it's a real contrast that the United States can draw between itself and countries like China that don't take advantage of those opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. And since the theme of this conversation is migration, statelessness, and belonging, I would like to turn our attention to the notion of home and, what is home? What does home feel like? Is home necessarily the place that we are born? And these are themes that have been central to my life and to my work as a writer since I was, like I said, a refugee at one point. Have your ideas personally, you, Ty, have your ideas of home sort of and what it means evolved as a result of the years that you spent writing this book?
Home for me has always been where I hang my hat, to use that horrible cliche. But it has changed the way I think about it. And for Assad, it was such an overwhelming, search that he was on. And for Marion, the other main protagonist of the book, I think that
in many ways, I think the hero of the book, actually.
She is a remarkable, remarkable woman, and the one who carries the family on her back, and is the reason that their home now is the United States. She was resettled. I'll come back to your question, but she was resettled in 2004, and sort of sent word to the family of what awaited them in America, helped them keep the faith alive, and then ultimately was the one that sponsored them for green cards and did the heavy lifting of getting there when the UN resettlement system stalled out and didn't work. Assad's journey toward finding a home took him all over the place. It took him. He knew he didn't belong. He knew that that Dadaab couldn't be a permanent home that had everything that he needed. He knew that it is part of his, I think, part of his identity today, and he will never, I think, turn his back on it in the way that many refugees do. I think a lot of people that I've met that have spent time there, they leave and they never look back. That has not been his experience. I think he feels drawn back to it. But he goes back on this journey to Somalia, hoping, I think, to find a place that he will fit in, a place that had space for him. He'd heard these stories from his family, and he goes back, and I think he's discouraged by what he finds there. He travels through Al-Shabab controlled territory, and ultimately concludes that Somalia isn't home either. And then when he wins the scholarship to Princeton, and I get to kind of have this front row seat to his journey to America, and I actually flew with him on the flight to come to New York. And my wife had lived in New York for 15 years before we moved to Kenya, and so it was sort of very important to her that we be there when he arrived and sort of show him around her home city. I really hoped that he would find what he was looking for here, and that was very important to me. And then to land in the middle of the Trump presidency was, a huge letdown, I think, for him, and a sort of a very painful experience to have dreamed about this country for so long and to have had such a high opinion of it, and then to see it just fall short of his expectations so spectacularly. And for me, very, very painful, because I had hoped to share my country with him and to share the things that I believe in about the American project, and a version of the American project in which someone like him has an important role to play.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're gonna start answering some questions from our viewers, but I just have one more question that I think I would love to ask you. And I'm currently, struggling with a novel about people who are very different from me, and I have been thinking a lot about, as a result of that, I've been thinking a lot about the act of storytelling, and also, not only that, but the role of the storyteller in our societies, and who also among us gets to tell, who's afforded the privilege of telling, your own stories, but as well as what are the limitations of actually trying to tell the stories of others, and how do we get at the sort of the truth of another human being's experience. And I wanted to ask you, as you've been working on this book and being on this journey, have you struggled with the question of, am I the right person to tell this story, given the sort of the differences between you and your subject?
I think it's a really, really important question, and the question of who tells whose stories, I think is rightfully being thrust into the debate right now, mainly because for years and years and years, the answer to that question has been really lopsided, that it has been, white foreigners, mainly men, coming into places that are not their homes and telling other people's stories. And so to that degree, I think that it's a worthy conversation that we need to be having. I think that where I come down on it is a less extreme and less definitive answer. I feel conflicted and torn in a lot of directions. I think that it's motivated by the right things, this idea to rectify this imbalance. I think the idea of ownership of stories is useful insofar as it's a corrective to the imbalance. If it allows more space for people who have been historically underrepresented, a space in the publishing world, a space in the journalism world, then I think it's a worthy idea. I think where it ends up limiting us is when you follow it through to its logical conclusion, which is that essentially that each person only can tell their own story, and we're left with a world in which the only genre of literature is memoir. And I think that we are then kind of impoverishing our literary world. I also think that there's another competing purpose of storytelling, which is to bridge worlds and to bring people together and to create pathways of understanding and to knock down kind of walls of fear, and to help people to understand each other. And so that's really what I tried to do in the book, is to be a portal into a world that I necessarily, of course, could not understand in the same way that my protagonists can, but certainly can get a better idea of it than an American who's sitting here, or someone who's had a totally different life experience. And I think that is an important function of storytelling, has been a function of storytelling for a very long time. I think that in this case, it ended up being a real privilege to do, because both Assad and Marian ended up being kind of guides to their worlds for me, in the same way that I could be, to a lesser extent, a guide to my world to them here, certainly when Assad arrived in the United States. And so I think there was a give and take and a conversation, even in the writing of the book.
Absolutely. But also, I couldn't agree with you more, by the way, personally. And also, I think one of the great things about stories, whether you're at the sort of the writing end or the reading end of it, is that it's an act of imagination, and a leap into another world and another sort of person's experience. And I personally wouldn't want to live in a world where I didn't have access to that ability to read and to write about, people and experiences that are so different from mine. So I couldn't agree with you more personally. But sort of, I said that was the last question, but I do have another question that I wanted to ask you, which I think sort of dovetails quite nicely into your answer. About 4 years ago, I published a small book about the experiences of African migrants and refugees in Italy and France. And I remember during the writing of that book, sometimes I would catch myself sort of trying to appeal to the sympathies of the reader, of some future reader. I couldn't even imagine who would read it, but sort of trying to appeal to their sympathies, not on my behalf, but on behalf of the people, the migrants and refugees I was writing about. And then a few years later, I came across a beautiful essay by Nazreen Malik, the author of the book, We Need New Stories. And in her essay, she writes, humanizing is a tricky business. We are always told that migrants need to be humanized if they are to be accepted. And she goes on to say that there is now a cottage industry of humanization in journalism that places at the center the human migrant. And I see, to me personally, the danger of this sort of humanization business is that it sort of flattens the people that are being written about into like sort of either, the barbarians at the gate who need to be kept at bay, or the sort of the magical refugee who is so, sort of deemed to so worthy and acceptance, and sort of worthy of acceptance and belonging. And there isn't really a whole lot of sort of the complexities that we afford ourselves. And I was wondering, as you were writing, first of all, do you agree with sort of Malik's idea that there is a cottage industry of humanization in journalism? And also, how did you avoid this particular sort of pitfall when you were writing about Assad, who is just about one of the most complicated, most sort of multidimensional human beings I've ever come across in a book?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I hate the word humanizing. I think that it should go without saying that your subject is human. It shouldn't be an act of the writer to breathe life into them. It's an absurd idea, and yet it endures even in reporting and reviewing of books today. You hear that it humanizes beautifully the migrant experience, and I think that that is it's a real indictment of I think both some of the writing and some of the way that it's being read. So when I talk about portals between worlds and building bridges, there's another point that I neglected to make, which is that I think that you need to be really careful about how you do that. There's one way of doing that that's sort of playing to people's expectations and biases and telling them what they want to hear about certain stories and narratives. And then there's telling stories as faithfully and as truthfully as you can, even if that is going to rub people the wrong way, is not going to necessarily pluck their heartstrings in the way that you want them to. So I think the word that you use, flattening, is an important one. You need to make sure that you're not flattening the characters, the narrative, in a way that certainly that kind of can fit them into preordained expectations and kind of categories that people have. The question that you had about the sort of model refugee and model immigrant problem.
What I call the magical refugee, which is sort of, my version of the magical Negro. That's just me.
It's also, I think, a real problem in the way that we tell these stories, and one that I really struggled with in writing this book, because as I told you before, the real impetus for it was this idea of permanent statelessness and this idea of grappling with what it means to be permanently in exile. And of course, Assad, as one of my two main protagonists, doesn't end up spending his whole life in the camp. He spends much of his life in the camp and then makes this really improbable and extremely unrepresentative leap into, he's literally the only refugee ever born in Dadaab to go to Princeton University. So about as unrepresentative as you can get from the refugee experience. I think certainly the way that I justified it to myself was that I balanced the need to tell this story that I thought was extraordinary and is a story worthy of telling, with a number of other characters that I wove around him that I think are more representative of the refugee experience, and kind of used them to contrast the experience. I think the danger is you read this book as a kind of easy breezy narrative of triumph over adversity, that he's clearing these obstacles, and if only refugees would work harder, they would all go to Princeton. That's obviously not the way that I intended the book to be written. And what I hope that they would take away from the book instead of that is a better sense of the obstacles themselves, the many, many things that keep people from achieving not just dreams like going to Princeton, but in many cases from living dignified lives that they would otherwise want to live. And so I think Becker, the character that is Assad's best friend, in many ways is much more representative of the refugee experience. But I think no less complicated and extraordinary I don't see a real contrast in terms of the complexity of either of their characters. I think that they're both extraordinarily driven and, just fascinating young men. And I think weaving their stories together with Marion's and the rest of the family, I think gives you some better sense of what it means to spend 3 generations or 3 decades of your life in exile.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. And also Mariam, who to me is just about as layered and interesting and complicated, and has all the edges of somebody who has had the kind of life that she has had. She is, as interesting to me as any kind of Victorian heroine, any great, Jane Austen novel could ever conjure. So I think you did a beautiful job of really showing, I hate to say this, Ty, but showing their humanity. There, I said it. And I feel like on that note, I've been really neglecting part of my hosting duties, which is to actually sort of get some answers, or some questions rather, that you have to answer. But I'm trying to figure out how does one see where these questions are?
Be in the chat. There's a chat.
Oh, okay. Maybe Anne can help us with this, because I don't actually see any questions here. Yeah, in the meantime, well, until somebody, oh, there's Anne. Okay.
Hello.
Yeah.
I can read a question if that is easiest.
Yes,
So we have
yes.
one from Nadja Drost, who's also another one of our Pulitzer Center grantees. And she asks when, and this can be for Ty and Hassan, but when you're tracking a story that is a family odyssey with much of it taking place before you came into it, and the more contemporary part allowing you to do the in-person reporting moments. Can you talk about the balance you strike or you have struck in your reporting between reconstructing these stories and scenes and the immersive in-person reporting?
Yeah, it was a big challenge to writing this book because the bulk of it happened before I met Assad. So probably 75% of the book is reconstruction. It's based on interviews that oftentimes multiple people who are experiencing the same event and kind of triangulating to try to get at a representative account of the event. In the end, one of the things that I ended up doing because that was so difficult was I ended up telling the story from the point of view of many of the characters. And in the early chapters in the book, I kind of alternate between Assad, Marion, and Becker's point of view. And so those are largely drawn from the recollections of the person, whose eyes we are looking through in those chapters. In the third section of the book, I come back, it's kind of a double chronology in the book. I run through the whole story in parts 1 and parts 2. And in part 3, I re-enter the frame as kind of the fretting, worried narrator. And that's kind of when you see some of the reporting firsthand. Marion and I go back to Dadaab to kind of try to answer this question that loomed over their whole lives, which is why was this, why did their family get ripped apart and why was half of the family left behind in Dadaab for so many years? And that's essentially straight reporting. Marion and I set out to answer a question. We do tons of interviews. We advance a theory of the case. But that's a fairly small part of the book. Most of it is purely based on informal interviews, hundreds and hundreds of hours of them recounting the same events over and over.
Mm.
And I know we're getting down to the last part. I'm just going to ask one other question that's from our audience that circles back to those points you were making. Another question is, how did you, Ty, think about maintaining dignity? So we've talked about these questions, but maintaining the dignity of the individuals and telling their stories. And then I'll hand it back to Hassan to help wrap us up before I come back.
I think that my characters were so dignified themselves that it was not actually something that I had to spend a lot of time thinking about. I think their stories come across as incredibly dignified, almost all of the characters, I suppose, with the exception of some characters you might describe as villains. There's an aid worker who ends up sabotaging the family's chances of resettlement. I wouldn't describe him as particularly dignified gentleman. There are a few others, but maybe it was a function of the subjects in this particular book. But it's a good question, but it's one that I don't think presented itself that much because of the way that these in a way, and maybe this is my own bias creeping in here, like I have often thought of refugee and migrant stories as kind of the epics of our time, the courage, the heroism, the sacrifice of people who are displaced from their homes and forced to flee because of violence. I think it's heroic in a kind of Homeric sense of the word. The filmmaker Deborah Eskenazi put it beautifully, I thought, when she said that refugees and migrants have to face down all of the monsters with the help of none of the gods. So that is, I think, a big part of the way that their stories kind of unfold when they tell them, and the way they were reflected in the book. A friend of mine mentioned to me and sort of pushed back on that idea, I think justifiably, a while back when I was chatting with her, reminding me that these stories are only heroic because of the obstacles that Western countries throw up in the face of refugees. That it's only heroic because they must overcome an impossible series of obstacles that are intended to keep them out of Western countries and from escaping the refugee experience.
Well, thank you. And Hassan, is there anything further before we wrap up? I know we're going to a minute or two over our time, but just want to give you any last words.
I have so many questions that I still wanted to ask Ty, but I'll reserve that for when I see him. But I just wanted to say congratulations to you for, as somebody who's attempted to write a tiny, nonfiction book, practically a leaflet, and the amount of work I put into that and how hard it was, I can't even imagine the amount of work you put into this book, but it shows beautifully. And I just wanted to say congratulations. And it's a huge and important addition to our discourse and discussions around probably one of the most important issue of our generation. So yeah, I just want to say thank you and congratulations. And thank you also to the Pulitzer Center for allowing us to have this conversation.
Thank you, Hassan. It was such a lovely conversation and such a privilege to get to have it with you today.
Okay. Well, thanks back to both of you, Hassan, Ghedi, Santur, and Ty McCormick. It really was such an important conversation to be had. And we want to also remind our audience, and they can share outward, that this conversation is recorded, so it'll be up on our website in the coming days. And so please feel free to share out. Thanks to my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Holly Peipenberg, our producer for this session. And we appreciate all of you in our audience today for joining us. For those of you who are able, please remember that we're a nonprofit journalism organization and we depend on donor support. So please, if you can, donate today and become a Pulitzer Center champion. Among our upcoming virtual events includes one this evening, which is a community forum on law enforcement oversight in Maine that has lessons for other regions around the United States. Also in the coming weeks, a webinar for educators that the public is invited to join, where author Stephen Johnson will be speaking about Extra Life, his latest book and a multi-platform project that shines light on the vaccines, inventions, and other factors that have enabled us to have longer average lifespans, but still examines how some of those factors have led to new challenges and inequities. Later in May, we'll also have an event in partnership with the Overseas Press Club that will examine Central American migration and involve several journalists, including Pulitzer Center grantee and OPC award winner Maria Hinojosa. There will be plenty more virtual and we hope soon public events ahead, so visit our website when you can. Stay with us a few minutes longer to take a brief survey after we officially end today's session. And thank you again for being with us, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.